Hello, everybody.
Speak linearly.
Um, okay, hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. I am pleased to welcome our guest, and also I'm her guest on the show, vice versa, Penny Bradley. She's known for many, many things, and can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And what's your story, and how you got here, what you're doing this life, and your mission. Sorry, there's a lot of questions. So, yeah, go in the the order you'd like.
Okay. Um, when I was 4, the CIA picked me up from my parents' house and drove me across country to Langley, where I was their guest for the next 5 years with a side trip to Montauk. And by the time they were done with me, I had 2,200 altars, and they were trained as various things from, well, everyone that was in my generation in the SSP has a sex slave altar, at least one. So you start with that
Hey,
and you go,
sensitive? What'd you say?
everybody from my generation in the secret space program has at least one sex slave altar.
Oh, okay.
So that's the baseline. That's what they start you with as part of the mind fracture process. And so you have that. You have alters that are trained to be assassins. You have alters who are trained to be ground thumper soldiers. You have alters who are trained for whatever specialty that they've decided you're equipped for. In my case, it was navigation with hyperspace drives.
Hmm, very interesting.
So, so I spent 5 years basically being tortured and trained. And then I was sent to Mars, where I was turned over to the Germans. And they put me in Schule for 10 years, which is their version of what we would call school. They teach things very differently than we do here on Earth. And the last year or so, I've been looking into what I was taught there versus what I was taught here, and then looking into, was what I was taught on Mars actually objectively factual? And I found that 90% of it was, and only about 40% of what I was taught in California schools was objectively factual. So I'm tending more to trust what I was taught there than what I was taught here. And once I'd gone through 10 years of Schule, because they wanted their people to be intelligent, then I was a fighter pilot for another 15 years. And the war on Mars ended in 1990 Earth time. And at that point, I was transferred to their military fleet, which they call Nachtwaffen. And I was a navigator there. Once I made that transfer, every altar that I have had serve in Nachtwaffen has been a navigator. The ones I've had serve in other factions have been other things.
Okay. I have a lot of questions that are raising with that. Very interesting. So, for people that don't know, this is going into evidence that one can look up when one goes down the rabbit hole of the SSP and the secret space program, unacknowledged secret projects that are funded, that started up having fracturization of factions, gaining technology, reverse engineering it, and then making their own breakaway civilization, and under guise of not needing to share among the surface dweller, of us being in history compared to them not as informed, and the Nazis had so much going on in the beginning, and had a lot of the booms that came up in the factions that engage in a secret space program, and then they launched off, and some of them shared technology, but like a lot of them had to start off their own 2 feet, because each faction wanted their own form of supremacy or elevation into a way where they could multi-purpose reach goals in things such as under the guise of protection for the planet, the solar system, forming mining colonies, forming self-sustainability, forming break away from the drama, having their own belief systems into what's going on here and how things should be run, in their own vote for what happens in Earth's future. So there's a lot to go into, but there's many things one can research going down this rabbit hole, and how they got this reverse engineered technology, and what ET groups they worked with, the Vril, the Nazi Bell, the New Schwabenland, the concepts of inner Earth, Antarctica, of bases, and the fleeing of the Nazi boats after World War II, and the whole mock thing that the Germans, when they broke off from the Nazis, and the Germans, their whole perpetuation of like, oh, the wars ended, and the Nazis essentially continued their war under the guise of secrecy, why we have continuation of our wartime flag, wartime. We never ended World War II with the Nazis. It was just mostly went underground, or into space, or like things that were kept in the idea that U.S. somehow won. And that's okay if people want to believe that, if they want, but ultimately things meet up in evidence and factors that will come into their reality in the future, and there's a bunch of evidence that determines otherwise. But yeah, seeing if I can make a little bit of a thing for new viewers that don't have any idea what we're talking about, but yeah. So So how did you? What was like your timeline of awareness back into your memory and stuff? Was it like different than other people you see whistleblowing? Did you always have it? Like, how did that happen?
I always had a trickle. Things that could, looking back on them, they were big red flags, but at the time each of them could be explained away. So my whole life it was this trickle. And I was having psi experiences the entire time, interaction with other dimensions, visitations from beings that were probably extraterrestrials, but at the time I didn't know what they were. Everything from what you would call totem spirits through angelics. And yeah, I've been one of those that was on the mystic side. And I mean, you know that, Sean. We've been talking for a long time. um, I'm not a normal, but in 2012, I took myself off the SSRI drugs that my doctor had me on for a while. I took them off against doctor's orders because while I was on them, my psi abilities were gone. And it was like losing my right arm. And I had been working in the public doing retail, and I actually needed them to be around people all the time. But I was disabled in 2009, and I've been basically homebound since. And so I didn't think I needed them. And when I came off them, my psi abilities started coming back within 6 weeks. And I had cut my hair in 2013. It was about 3 inches long all over. And when I started growing it back out, when it hit my waist, the telepathy part just skyrocketed. So the Vril ladies were correct that the long hair does help with the telepathy. So, gee, what do I say next? This was what I thought we were going to talk about. So I'm not exactly prepared.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just building up to like the greater stuff, so it's not like we just throw the audience into the deep end of the pool. Yeah, let's see what can we talk about that builds it up to where you want to talk about with the time travel and dimensions and stuff.
You did ask how I got my memories back and if it's different. Yes. I met an NSA agent online on Facebook, and we were friends for about 3 years when he invited me to come spend a couple of weeks with his family. This wasn't as bad as it sounds. But he sent me the money for the round trip plane ticket, and he paid for everything while I was there. And he used my personal remember code from my programming. So when I came home to Lou, it was like it hit with a vengeance. I was actually okay until I got on the plane to come home. And then the first thing that hit was the paranormal effects. I had been a devout Christian before, and all of that just fell off me. I still remember it all. I still remember having faith, but I don't have faith anymore. And I was lucid 24/7. I still am if I don't take something to sleep with. So this is since April of 2013. And my memories came back in this big lump that was all in German. And I speak German like a little kid in my Earth life. I have studied it in school, 3 years in high school, 2 years in junior college, and then I took a literature class. But all of that was before 1985. So it's been a long time ago. And no one in my real world speaks German. So my I understand when I read it. I understand less when I hear it, and I can barely speak it. I can't remember the verbs. I can't remember the genders of the nouns to be able to do the declensions, and conjugating verbs is difficult, especially when you can't remember what the right verb was.
Oh yeah, this is like a phenomenon I've been dealing with as well. Uh, it feels like a sense of anxiety when I come up against reading a whole bunch of words in another language that I have known before. Like I've dreamed of talking in German and other languages. My family's German, so it's when I read into the anxiety, it's like a big block that like, oh, you know kind of what this is, but there's something preventing you from knowing it more. So it's like this part of the amnesia barrier. And I was like reading into a whole bunch of the systems of the block, because like part of the altar is to bring into the awareness, because it's like all the knowingness is kept in that altar, and so it's like if you're relearning it, it's kind of weird because it feels like you're working extra hard to relearn the same thing.
Mhm.
Does that sound familiar?
That sounds incredibly familiar. The code word that was used actually brought up that altar for reintegration. And she has been learning English faster than I have been learning German. And we're at a point where we are almost merged, but not quite. And as long as all of those memories are sitting there in a language that I really don't speak well, it's I had to do research to understand what it was she was remembering.
Right. Because how much of
So
your timeline would change if you remembered German and then you were able to bring up all this memory and language? So a lot of things want to stop the block right there. I mean, keep that going.
yeah, well, the here and now person, the one you're seeing on the screen, okay?
Oh,
I I I have spoken Portuguese, California Spanish, French, and German, but all before 1980. And I had a stroke in labor in 1984. So I had to actually relearn to speak English at that point. So I tend to use a more simplistic form of English because of that stroke. I understand all the big words, but I tend to not use them. So, yeah, I'm understanding what you're saying completely. But if I suddenly just stop, it's because I still have aphasia from that stroke.
yeah.
So,
And there seems to also be this thing where some people have it, some people don't. It's a language. It's kind of like language barriers, but like where a language that a person, if anyone sees this as familiar, um, they've learned a language and they suddenly start forgetting that whole language they've learned, and it like reverberates back, and it kind of like something really doesn't want them to cross those boundaries, and that's part of the blockage and amnesia barrier. Like if because there's parts of the brain is so interesting, but it's kind of like what can be lit up at any given time can be shut down, and once that's shut down, because it's like a branching tree of memory that like branch off each other in a whole language. Um, like if you've I'm kind of trying to use metaphor. If you're in a dream and you're speaking in a whole nother language, all that knowingness is just like instant, and it's like, oh wow, of course I know this language. And as soon as you fade out of that, it like it you it kind of like goes away, and it's like, what? Why is what? I just did
Yes,
this.
yes, 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 yes.
So
That's exactly what it's like. Yes.
it's weird, but apparently this is like a big blockage that things really want to put a lot of force into stopping, which could lead to, if somebody remembers all their alters, it would change the timeline quite dramatically, and be able to speak all that. But there's people that have been able to bust through that barrier. So, and people that wake up with sudden savant syndrome, and they are able to speak an entirely different language, whether it be from a past life or something interacting with this life, kind of stuff.
Yeah. I've been working on relearning the German, and I've been reading it to relearn it. I would probably relearn it a lot faster if I had someone local here and now that spoke it, but I don't. So, since I don't use it in an everyday form, my theory is that if they picked me up, dropped me off in Germany or Austria or Switzerland in the German-speaking areas, that would, by the end of 3 months, I would be speaking like a native. But in the meantime, this stuff is sitting there, and I've managed to work out the stuff, the memories from this pile that were in simple German. The parts that were in technical German are still sitting there waiting to be weeded through. So that's why I can't explain how to build the machines, how to build the drive. I can tell you, well, this drive has this effect, like the drive that they're calling the EM drive. We called it a copper microwave drive. And the effects are, in an atmosphere, it builds this beautiful teardrop-shaped field. And if you're inside that field, it's safe to create a portal. If you're outside that field, the portal will suck the atmosphere off the planet. So those are the kinds of things I remember. But I can't tell you how to build it. So, strange things.
What is some of your awareness on how alters work, with how they, well, with what you remember?
I have reintegrated 30 altars out of 2,200. And I have used Native American shamanic soul retrieval technique to do this. And then sat Jungian shadow work style beside the other altar as we slowly merged together. And the hard part of that is making sure that the here and now penny stays dominant. Some of these have been very strong altars that if I had not struggled, they would have become penny. The particular altar that was on Mars was that strong. And she would have been sitting here speaking German to you. And she was very Teutonic and liked to toy with people. And in the group, there are days when she pops out and I will find somebody that's just being an ass. And she will sit there and pick at them, sometimes for hours on end, just pick at that person. And then Penny will be back, and her name there was Lieutenant Penelope Dalkirchen. And when the lieutenant is out, The rest of the admins in the group sit there and laugh because they know she's going to torment someone. And usually it's the one being the biggest ass of the day. So Tomas is our founder, and he will come and just occasionally toss something in just to keep her going.
So, what do you know about the expansion of the different factions of the Nazi secret space program and how it's expanded past the planet?
Okay, I can tell you from the German point of view because this was something they taught in Schule. They discussed there being almost 3,000 years of persecution of the German tribes by authorities based in Rome. First it was the Roman Republic, then it was the Roman emperors, and then it was the Vatican, and at the end it was the Jesuits. That this entire, at least 2,500 years, that the German people were being consistently persecuted, and at times there were actual genocides aimed at them. And so when they were offered the opportunity for the technology to leave, the aristocracy accepted. And it wasn't in the Nazi era. It was back, I don't know if you know about Sir John Dew and Edward Kelly. They were in the Queen Elizabeth I era, the 1600s. John Dew and Edward Kelly were the first to make contact with a group that they called angelics, or I forget the exact name they called the language. But this was Enochian, you're right. And so this was the beginning of the tech transfer. We're not talking about 1910, 1930. We're talking about 1600 was when this stuff started. And they had blood rituals that were required in exchange for the tech, because the particular beings they contacted were addicted to adrenochrome. So this is the beginning of how the Germans got the technology, and the persecution was the reason for it. So John Dee and Edward Kelly got in trouble with Queen Elizabeth, and over what, well, they were being accused of magic, and this was in a time where witches were burned at the stake. So they took refuge in Prussia. Well, Prussia had been the territory of the Teutonic Knights up until a couple of hundred years before that. And they had been there conducting crusades against the pagans who were in Prussia, Latvia, Lithuania. And they got cocky and attacked Poland. And the King of Poland and his army basically wiped them out, and they stopped being a military order after that. But they had basically created the blueprint of Prussia as the dominating force of Germany. So where did John Dee and Edward Kelly go? They went to Prussia, along with the ability to contact these beings that were giving tech, actual, real, physical tech, in exchange for adrenochrome. And about that same time, there were a couple of Jewish guys that were coming up with with what became the religious basis for the Illuminati. So they were also wandering around Europe at the same time. So I'm sure there was cross-pollination. After all, Bavaria is on the border of Prussia, and they came up with the Bavarian Illuminati. So you've got neighbors doing similar things. Now, today, what John Dew and Edward Kelly were doing would be called CE5. But in that time, they were summoning angels and writing down what they were told. In the era of the American Civil War, they were calling it spiritism or spiritualism. And there were a whole range of people involved with that for 150, 200 years. So this has never gone away. They just changed the name every so often. And Madame Blavatsky was one of the practitioners that they called it spiritualism, and she renamed it to Theosophy and tied Eastern faiths into it. So you've got this whole history here, and the Prussians are right at the forefront because John Dee gave it to them in the 1600s. So who were the master engineers of Europe? The Germanic peoples. Germany, Austria, Switzerland. They were the ones that were the engineers. Anyway, before they got this tech. So the technology was going to people who could implement it. And they had a motive. Because during that same time, well, just before that, between the time the Teutonic Knights were wiped out and the time that John Dee showed up, the Inquisition had gone through. The Jesuits had gone through all of Germany's, and I say it that way because they were independent kingdoms, but the Inquisition had gone through the entire region and were wiping out anyone that they called a witch. And there would be entire regions that had no population at all. And they were killing off the women in the places that they left people. There would be entire regions, little countries, little valleys that there were no women, and most of the men were also dead by the time the Inquisition got done. And if that's not a genocide, I don't know what you would call it. So then they get to the point where they had the Kaisers coming out of Prussia, and they wanted to unify all the German-speaking countries. Now, yeah, they had a big ego, and they were little emperor types. That's why they called themselves Kaiser, because it was for Caesar. And so they were trying to unite all of the Germanic tribes, but what they said in Mars was that it was because if they were united, the Jesuits couldn't keep trying to kill them. So then we get to the end of the Kaiser period and World War I, where they were still working on uniting all the Germans. Well, at the end of World War I, the treaty was so bad, and the government had been eliminated, and they were given this liberal democracy that the Weimar Republic, who had no clue what they were doing, and the bankers at the same time were printing more money than was even remotely remotely reasonable. And so all the people who were on pensions, you know, the widows, the veterans, those people, they were on these limited incomes that suddenly were nothing because the money was being printed faster than it could possibly adapt. And so you had a large proportion of the old, the sick, and the weak who were literally starving to death. This was becoming a genocide after World War II. I mean, after World War I. And the aristocracy was who was in the Tula Gesellschaft, the Tula Society, and their women were in the Vril Society, Vril Gesellschaft. And they found this guy that they thought would be a good puppet for them. And they created the Nazi Party as a vehicle to put him in power. But the Nazis were never actually in charge. The Tula Society was. The aristocracy was. The aristocracy brought down the Weimar Republic because it was killing the people. Well, the basics that were going on was the treaty was not allowing certain industries, so the people had no jobs. The first thing that Hitler actually did was he restored the railroad industry, and with it the iron and coal industries, and traded those for commodities instead of money, because no one was allowed to give Germany money. And he came up with his own currency that was based on hours of work instead of on gold. So it bypassed the bankers. And both ideas were absolutely genius. And he literally saved people who were being starved to death. And after that, it didn't matter what he did, they would have followed him into hell and back. And they did. When you see that going on, when you see people around you dying because there's no work, there's no food, the money's worthless, and this crackpot shows up and actually fixes the problems, that's why he got the response that he did. Now, we're watching similar issues in America where there is work, but it's so low paying that people are having to have 2 or 3 jobs to cover bills. You can't afford to have kids. In my state, we've got a tremendous problem with homelessness. And most of those people are dead in the first year they're homeless. So we're looking at similar problems in America. Well, Hitler decided to make an enemy of the ethnic group that were the bankers, which were the Jews. He externalized the problem. And so all of the people took all their frustration and aimed them at the bankers and their people. Now, this was wrong. But at the same time, we're watching the American government now is doing the same thing to the Mexican immigrants who they are blaming the criminal activities on. They're blaming the lack of jobs because these foreigners are coming and taking them. So it's exactly the same process. Now, I'm not seeing any of the immigrants actually being murdered in the streets or in these camps yet, but give them time. We've got half of our population screaming this is wrong is probably the only reason that it's not happened yet. where Hitler took the dissidents and put them in the camps too. So, you know, you get the whole backstory, and there's also evidence that everybody in Europe already knows. It's only Americans that don't. At the end of World War II, most of the German veterans surrendered to the Americans and the Allies because they thought they'd be treated better than if the Russians took them. I'll tell you, the Russians took the ones that surrendered to them, they put them in prison camps for either 10 years or 20 years and then turned them loose. What did the Americans do? They built pens and put them in. And they did not give them food or water. And when 80% of them were dead, they buried all of them with caterpillars, bulldozers. All of Europe knows this. This is not a secret anywhere else but here.
Right, yeah. The U.S. government covers up so much, and they just like, we're the best country in the world, and we can write our own history, and you'll all believe it, whatever.
There were 3 genocides in Germany in the first half of the 20th century. 2 of them killed Germans, and 1 killed Jews. So I'm saying both of those peoples were victimized. And you're right, we still haven't ended World War II. They still don't have a treaty. They have no rights even in their own countries. And it's not just Germany, but also Austria and Switzerland and all of those little countries through there. They don't have peace treaties. They don't have rights. And yet, whenever the Germans managed to escape into space, the Americans built Solar Warden to come chase them down, taking World War II into space. All the Germans wanted was to be free. Now, I've told their side, which has been forgotten by almost everybody.
So, what have you learned about the history that got them into space, and like history and travel with like the real contactees, and like how they so like people that are skeptical about this have like a little bit of a rabbit hole that they can go down in key terms, so that it, like, as we build up to the greater and greater forms of information and technology we can talk about in psychic awareness, we can say what like, oh yeah, this is happening, and like if you're open and aware, and if it's not already happened to you, as you find yourself getting multidimensional, you'll run across these things.
Keywords for Google search. Enochian magic. The races that I know they contacted right away, they got the Aldebaran, who did talk to the Vril ladies. They got a variety of gray that is from Zeta Reticuli, and the American government calls them Ebens, and they claim to have created us. They got, well, later on they got Draco, but
a lot of things claim to have created us, right?
There are at least 25 races in space who claim to have created humans with their own DNA.
Right.
And they all expect us to kiss their asses, and because of it. And the Germans told them that they were bad parents, that we were not going to give them honor. And I don't blame them.
Yeah, parents.
So If they had wanted honor, they should have been better parents. That's what the Germans said. What else should they look up? They should look up the Tula Society. They should look up the Vril Society, and it's spelled V-R-I-L-L. And Maria Orsich was their leader. And these were male and female of the same group. And Maria Orsich, I believe it was her stepfather, took what she found to Hitler. So, and he was in Tula. So these people were working together. They're not separate agencies. Hitler had to give approval for the Germans under Nazis to have funding to pursue this. But the Vril Society, these ladies were aristocracy. They had money. They were building their own ships themselves. And when Hitler showed up, he wanted to take everything, the ships, the blueprints, everything. And Orsich told him, basically, fuck you. You can have copies of the blueprints, and I'll let your men look at what we're doing. And she disappeared before the end of World War II, and a lot of people think she went to Aldebaran. She had an invitation to go there. I'll tell you, the German ships who followed her later, they got instantly vaporized as soon as they hit the system. The folks at Aldebaran are not friendly.
What do you know about Aldebarans?
I know about that as a navigator, I know that there is a wide space around it that is a no-go zone. You just don't go there because unless they let her in, they've never let anybody in. They don't want anything to do with us.
I've tracked back some of their bases. They're pretty interesting. The ones, because I visited Germany a bit, there are a few like deep underground, like under like big access points of energy stargates, and some that were previous in history in like big points for the Nazi Party, but it seemed a lot of things have changed, and wars that were underground that like tried to move in and step on their process, so they've been like moving around to more secret locations now on Earth as well as in the solar system, from what I've able to tell. But they pretty much have like a foothold on every planet that I can see, interestingly. But yeah, I think they're like, because they're a greater chess move of what they're monitoring. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm fascinated. I had not even considered remote viewing them because I have this thing that they are so dangerous. I want nothing to do with them. I don't want them to even know I'm here.
Oh yeah?
I've had contact with races that know me from space. There was a group of mantids that were not part of the Empire, but a separate race, that they had had a battle and their homeworld had been destroyed. And they contacted me to make contact with Das Bundes. That's what the breakaway culture calls itself, the Federation in English. And they made it really clear when they contacted me that they considered they were summoning a demon. And I was like, I didn't think I was that bad. It was war. I wasn't, when I'm not at war, I'm not dangerous. Well, not actively dangerous. I guess potentially dangerous is a better description. But
When you
it was a real shock to my system to have an entire race of beings, and they're a hive mind race. So I was contacted by all of them at once. This was a hive mind that contacted me, and they considered they were so desperate they were contacting a demon.
the mantids,
That particular group of mantids, yes, they thought they were summoning a demon, and that was,
it's like when you summon a human.
you know,
We are
you're
super
desperate.
dramatic.
You're desperate, right? And it's like, okay, but their homeworld had been destroyed, and there were six ships of them were all that were left of their people, and they were just desperate. They were running out of supplies, had nowhere to go. And so they massively contacted me. And I said, so what am I that you guys think I'm a demon? And they called me a destroyer of worlds. I'm like, I see.
I've had that.
So,
Don't worry about it. It's just a title from like experience. It's not like
well,
it's the whole spectrum of your universe, and like because every human is like a angel, a demon, one. Because we're we're balancing the expression of the whole multiverse in each of our bodies as a whole universe, and it's like the best of the best have to be here because of what it takes to be here and survive and not want to just kill yourself because of the amount of waves of trauma that are building up in like fracture of each life and the culmination of karma being reflected in every moment and in like it being like nothing to us because we're born into it. We don't have compare and contrast while other species that are super empathic and like lighting light and love and all that can't step foot here without getting a heart attack or heart palpitations. So,
yeah.
demon as in you're extremely resilient. Some demons are afraid of us for sure. Yeah, I agree.
But so many of the folks that I know here on Earth would have considered the mantids to be demons, and yet they thought I was bad.
Right.
So, the irony of it and the sheer shock value of that's what they thought of me. But I did manage to get a hold of Das Bundes, and I passed on what I translated as a request for a new home world. And I requested it to be somewhere that did not already have its own sentient life form. And they found them a world. It was a little bit small for them, but compared to what their home world had been, but it was a jungle planet that had everything it would need. It was just a little on the small side. And they were just absolutely tickled. And, you know, they occasionally come check on me since then out of gratitude. So that was cool. I may be a demon, but at least I helped somebody. And they were like, "Well, why did you help us?" And I said, "I'm not at war with you anymore. I have, the version of me here, all of that's done. I have no reason to do you harm, and your request was reasonable." And they were like, "Oh."
Yeah, like the species that are outside the solar system that are like in perpetual war and they have like an entirely different mental like schism of like it's been like this for so long it's like impossible to get out of it and comparatively come in and here like the amount of things that throw are thrown at us, it's like, oh, we want is peace. We don't need war anymore. Fuck. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, you know, I just um when I started realizing some of the abilities that I had because the agencies left me chipped into various weapons platforms. And I had to stop and actually think about, okay, I'm attached to this. I have these capabilities. Do I really need to be using them? So, yeah, I've mentioned it once or twice in interviews before, but the only time I can really use them is if I think I'm in personal danger, and not just like my hand's going to be slapped, but like I'm going to be killed.
Yeah, right.
And then I can suddenly access the switchboard that has a dozen different kinds of weapons, and they're all weapons of mass destruction. And I'm like, no, I don't want to blow up the planet over this idiot shooting at me.
Yeah, the same thing. It's pretty interesting. It's like, oh well, this helps the future with the modes, so that you don't just like, because like the continuing the dream as it is, unimpeded, limited. Like limited limits have like a certain ramification if they're keeping the dream going in its highest resolution for each person, and that being the goal of like how they resolve so much of their other lives and their entire ancestry and lineage and all the records of species they're connected to in their super hybrid of their DNA. That's resolving the entire universe while they're being here, as a
Yeah.
representation. So like when it's challenged and there's things cheating and like Earth lets you off the chain as like a Rottweiler for the different abilities that you have accumulated that like switch into the altar. It just all clicks and it's like, you can just uh, do it and not have to like know how it works, because the knowing kind of just comes with the doing, and it just you feel it being successful, and you have these visions that come along with it, and so it's fun. So for
Well,
people
I'm
that
glad.
are having these experiences, please contact people such as Penny or Brave Soul in her Facebook group, and myself if you want to heal through
Well,
these memories and get support for a community that is loving.
you're one of the admins. They can contact you to be added too.
So can you yes, come to us. We'll help you. We'll help you reclaim your sovereignty from a lot of these programs. You will be a key factor in changing them for the better, and everyone winning, because this doesn't have to be a chess move of them or us. It doesn't have to be war. It's like we are all one, and they're just under the guise of illusion of being separate and ego, and it's a healing process for what they have too. And as they entered and forced into your game, whether it be like a small amount of incursion or a huge amount of incursion, it will give you a large degree of chess moves in what manifests to them. Do not lose hope. Do not lose your heart, your power, your love, who you are. You are the universe, and you can overcome anything that you've been given. Your higher self wouldn't give it to you if it wasn't confident that you could overcome it, and use it as a training that will completely shift everything. Can you name drop how to reach you?
Um, Penny Bradley on Facebook, uh, Space Portals with an S dot net. Um, and my YouTube is Pennywinkle B. I'm trying to get it changed to Nachtwaffen Pilot, but YouTube has not been cooperating so far.
Me neither. um, okay. And what do you do on space portals?
I'm the front end admin, the one that talks to everybody. That's also where I do my counseling, and I do give discounted rates for low income people, and I'm charging now because people didn't take my time seriously. So
You can also join the Secret Space Program group on Facebook. And
well, it's by invitation only these days,
yes. So
because we were getting a lot of people who thought it was a game. And so you need to know someone who's already in the group, so you can contact me. My profile pic has Free Penny Bradley on it. So when you do a Penny Bradley search, that'll be the one. And talk to me, tell me your story. And if you're an experiencer, I'll add you.
wonderful. And
So, or if you're a family member of an experiencer, because we know that no person is alone in the world, and I've added my partner and my youngest son and his wife to the group, because your family needs to know the realities too. So if you have a spouse who thinks you're nuts, they may still think you're nuts afterwards, but at least they'll know you're not alone.
and then the family grows in the seen and unseen, the different dimensions of reality, and we all work together and in a collective, and to help to bring things to peace. And as beings come more into their power, they will see that in those layers as well. You can also contact me, and I'd be honored. With any experiences you're having, I can help you remember as well as release, heal things and traumas and affecting your current state of being, so you can balance yourself and go more into your abilities, as well as learn how to do this stuff yourself. You can reach me at psionicleague.com. I'm also on Facebook, Sean Bond. Silver Cord Space Spiritual Science YouTube, for more content like this. And I hope to be doing more interviews with this lovely soul here. And if you like this video, please share it. Share it with
Share it widely.
yes. And comment your questions and other things you'd like for future videos, and let us know if you like this subject matter, and we'll continue to do things like this. Anything else you wanted to say as we wrap things up?
No, you covered it pretty well.
Wonderful. Thank you all so very much, and for all your bravery, and I love you all, and let us all come to a remedy for all this aspect of the universe as we become aware of every person's perspective and how to empower what we've been given. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.